The video clip was 47 seconds long. I know because I watched it 11 times. It arrived in my inbox at 6:23 in the morning on December 26th. No subject line, no message, just an MP4 attachment from an email address I didn't recognize. I almost deleted it. I'm glad I didn't, though not for the reasons you might expect. I was sitting at my kitchen table when I opened it. My laptop was in front of me, a mug of coffee to the right, still steaming. By the time the clip finished playing for the first time, the coffee had started to go cold. I didn't reach for it again. The footage was shot on a phone, slightly tilted, the way videos look when someone is trying not to be noticed recording. The dining room was fully lit. The Christmas centerpiece, a low arrangement of white candles and frosted pine branches that I had helped my mother pick out at a market 3 years earlier, sat in the middle of the table. My father was at the head, wearing the burgundy holiday sweater my brother had given him 2 Christmases ago. My brother was to his left. My 2 aunts were across from each other, wine glasses in hand. My chair, the one to my father's right, where I had sat every Christmas of my life, was empty. I watched my father lift his glass. I watched the others follow, and then I heard him say, with the relaxed confidence of a man making a toast he had clearly been looking forward to, "The table is better without the drama." They laughed. All 4 of them. Comfortable, easy laughter. The kind that belongs to people who are not worried about being overheard. The glasses met somewhere above the centerpiece with a clean, bright clink. Then the clip ended. I found out later it was my cousin who sent it. She had been sitting just outside the frame and had recorded it in the moment without fully knowing why, she told me afterward. She spent the better part of Christmas night deciding whether to send it. She sent it at 6:21 a.m. on December 26th. It reached me 2 minutes later. I watched it 11 times. Not because I was looking for a reason to be hurt, I was looking for information. I noted the timestamp in the clip's metadata. I noted who was present. I noted who was laughing and who was not. I noted that no one looked uncomfortable. That was perhaps the most useful piece of information of all. Not what they said, but how entirely at ease they were saying it. I want you to understand something clearly before I tell you the rest of this. I was not sitting at that table crying into a laptop on December 26th. I was not devastated. I was not blindsided. I was not surprised. I was prepared. What my family did not know, what none of the 4 people in that video had any reason to suspect, was that 4 days later, on the morning of December 30th, a lawyer carrying a manila folder walked through the front door of that same house. And every assumption they had made about what they owned, what they had built, and what I was willing to accept was about to be renegotiated from the ground up. People ask me sometimes how someone stays that calm in a moment like that. I understand why they ask. Watching a video of your own family toast your absence and not falling apart seems like it requires an explanation. The explanation is simple, though it took years to build. I had not been preparing for that moment for a few weeks. I had not been preparing for a few months. By the time that clip landed in my inbox on December 26th, I had been quietly, methodically preparing for 3 years and 4 months. What my family toasted that Christmas night was what they believed was my defeat. What they didn't know was that I had spent those 3 years building something in complete silence, and on December 30th, they were about to find out exactly what that was. I'm going to take you through every step of it, the pattern that started long before that dinner, the slow erosion that most people in this situation never fully name until it's too late. The build. Every layer of it, constructed carefully and legally while no one was paying attention. And finally, the moment the folder opened on my father's kitchen table. Before I do, I want to acknowledge something. Cornell sociologist Carl Pillemer conducted one of the most comprehensive national studies on family estrangement ever completed in the United States. His findings estimated that at least 27% of American adults, roughly 67 million people, are estranged from at least one family member. That number is not an anomaly. It is not a collection of extreme cases. It is a quiet, widespread reality that most people carry without ever saying it out loud. If you're watching this, there's a real chance you already know exactly how this starts. The beginning was not dramatic. That is the part that takes the longest to explain. There was no single explosion, no moment I could point to in real time and say, this is where it turned. It was slower than that, more deliberate. Looking back now, I can identify the exact inflection point, though I didn't have the language for it until much later. It was the summer I was 23 years old, roughly 18 months after I had started working inside my father's business. That was the summer his long-term business partner retired. And that was the summer my father brought my brother in as an operational co-owner. There was no formal vote. There was no board discussion. No meeting. No board discussion. There was no meeting in which anyone sat across from me and acknowledged that I had been working inside that business for nearly 2 years, the first 8 months of which I had worked without any salary at all, and the following 10 months at $28,000 a year. I had looked up comparable roles at the time. An outside hire in a position with equivalent responsibilities was commanding between $52,000 and $58,000 annually in our market. I was aware of that gap. I was 23 and I was aware of it, and I said nothing because I had been told, more than once, in more than one conversation, that family businesses operate on a different set of rules. That phrase was one of several I came to recognize as part of a very specific script. We're investing in your future. That was another one. Blood before contracts. And the one that appeared most often during the summer my brother was brought in. Your brother needs this more right now. I heard that last phrase 4 times in the span of 6 weeks. I stopped counting after that. What followed over the next 4 years moved in 3 distinct phases, and I want to be precise about each one, because precision is the only thing that separates a credible account from a grievance. The first phase was exclusion. It happened gradually enough that I might have missed it entirely if I hadn't been paying attention. I was removed from the distribution list for internal meeting notes sometime in the early fall of that same year. I noticed because a client deliverable referenced a decision I had never been informed of. A client dinner I had helped to organize was rescheduled, and I was told about the new date 2 hours before it took place. Not long enough to attend, long enough to make the notification feel intentional. The one that stayed with me longest was the rebranding project. I had initiated it. I had written the brief, interviewed 3 vendors, and managed the first 2 months of the process entirely on my own. When the final materials were presented to a new prospective client 8 months later, the project was introduced as my brother's work. Not collaboratively. Not jointly. His. The second phase was financial. In March of the 4th year, my father verbally confirmed in front of 2 other people that I would receive a 15% equity share in the business. I remember the specific language he used because I wrote it down that evening. 11 months later, in the following January, I received a brief email informing me that the business had undergone a structural reorganization. The filing had already been completed. My name was not in it. When I asked for an explanation, I was told the reorganization had been a formality, that the equity conversation was still something we could revisit, and that I needed to be patient. I have since learned that a 2025 YouGov nationally weighted poll found that among adults estranged from a parent, 34% cited manipulative behavior, and 31% cited lies or betrayal as primary causes of the estrangement. I didn't need a poll to tell me. I had the emails. The third phase was the quietest and, in some ways, the most damaging. It was the reframing of my identity within the family's internal narrative. I became aware of it gradually, a shift in the language people used when they spoke about me. Early on, the word was ambitious. I heard it often enough that it felt, if not warm, at least neutral. By the 5th year, the word had changed. The word was now difficult. I first noticed it at a Thanksgiving dinner when my aunt used it in a sentence that was technically about something else. I noticed it because that year, I had spent the better part of 11 months working 58-hour weeks to keep the business's largest client contract from collapsing. A contract that, had it terminated, would have cost the business an estimated $180,000 in annual recurring revenue. I had done that work largely alone, and at that Thanksgiving table, I was difficult. I drove home that night without saying anything. That was becoming a habit. The moment I made my decision was a Tuesday in August, in a parking lot outside a building where I had just sat through a meeting in which my father credited my brother, by name, in front of a client, for a project I had researched, drafted, and delivered over 6 weeks without assistance. I sat in my car for a few minutes. I was not crying. I was not shaking. I opened the glove compartment, took out a new notebook I had purchased and never used, and wrote 2 words at the top of the first page. Build quietly. Then I started the car and drove home. The notebook sat on my kitchen counter for 3 days before I wrote anything else in it. I want to be precise about what the quiet build was and what it was not. It was not impulsive. It was not emotional. It was not, at any point, illegal. I had spent years watching decisions get made without documentation, promises evaporate without consequence, and work disappear into someone else's credit. And I had learned one thing clearly from all of it. The only protection that functions reliably is the kind you build yourself, in writing, in advance. So that is what I did. Methodically, in 3 distinct layers over 36 months. I did not poach anyone. I want to be clear about that distinction because it matters both legally and practically. Poaching is visible. Poaching creates enemies and paper trails of the wrong kind. What I did instead was cultivate. Over the first 8 months, I identified the 7 client accounts within the family business that I had either personally originated or substantially grown. These were relationships that existed in large part because of my specific attention to them, my follow-through, my communication style, my institutional knowledge of what each client actually needed versus what they said they needed. I began meeting with key contacts from those accounts outside of business hours. Lunches, coffee, occasionally a phone call on a Saturday morning when someone had a question they didn't want to route through the main office. I was not soliciting. I was not making promises. I was deepening trust that already existed, and I was keeping records of every interaction, the date, the location, what was discussed, what I had offered in terms of insight or assistance. Those records were kept in a personal document, stored on a personal device, accessible only to me. By the end of month 8, I had informal but clearly documented confirmation from 3 of those 7 clients that their confidence was in me personally, not in the business name on the letterhead. I made no formal ask during this phase. I was building goodwill. Goodwill that could be converted later, at the right moment, under the right conditions. There were 2 people inside the family business I had trained personally. Both were capable in ways that were not being utilized. I knew this not from assumption, but from direct observation, and from things each of them had expressed to me, in writing, over the course of normal work communication. Frustration with their trajectory, uncertainty about the business's direction, questions about what their options looked like. I did not respond to those messages with promises I couldn't legally honor. I responded with what I could legitimately offer. Industry introductions, LinkedIn recommendations drafted carefully and published publicly, and consistent professional presence. I stayed in their orbit without pulling them anywhere I hadn't yet built. In month 14, I registered my LLC. The filing cost $150 through my state's online business registration portal. It took 1 afternoon. What took considerably longer was the operating agreement, a document I had drafted with a contract attorney over 3 sessions at a flat fee of $1,200, and which contained 3 provisions I considered non-negotiable. The first was a clause assigning all client work product exclusively to the LLC, with no ambiguity about ownership of deliverables. The second was a non-disparagement clause that would protect the LLC and its founding members from retaliatory public or professional commentary. A provision I included specifically because I understood the environment I was operating adjacent to. The third was a first right of refusal clause on any new contracts sourced by founding members, which ensured that any business relationship developed under the LLC's umbrella remained there. Within the first quarter after registration, both of the colleagues I had maintained relationships with had joined the LLC. Neither of them required much convincing. They had been watching the same patterns I had. This is the layer that made December 30th possible. Over 19 months, I built or acquired 4 specific assets. The first was a proprietary client management workflow, a system I had originally designed while working inside the family business, but which I had developed entirely using my personal accounts, on personal devices, during personal time outside of contracted business hours. That distinction is not incidental. It is the legal basis on which IP ownership becomes contestable, and I had been deliberate about it from the beginning. The second asset was a vendor network, 11 independent contractors across 4 functional areas, all of whom I had sourced and vetted independently, none of whom had any formal relationship with the family business. The third was a software license, a platform the family business had been using on an informal trial basis that I had personally initiated and never formally transferred. The license was registered under my LLC's name. It had been, from the beginning, in my name. The fourth asset was the most important one, and it was not a system or a license or a workflow. It was documentation. Over 26 months, I compiled a 94-page PDF. It was organized by category, not by emotion. The categories were precise. 11 documented instances of financial promises made verbally or in writing. 7 instances of formal credit misattribution, each with supporting project files. 4 formally documented exclusion events with dates and corroborating correspondence. And 1 item I had placed at the front of the document, behind the index tab, because it was the single most significant piece of evidence in the entire folder. It was a text message from my father, sent 14 months before December 30th, in which he stated, plainly, in writing, without ambiguity, that I had been the reason the business's largest client had renewed their contract for a 3rd consecutive year. He had written it in a moment of genuine acknowledgement. I had screenshotted it the same day, printed it, and had it notarized as a true copy within the week. That document lived in 3 separate encrypted locations from the moment I processed it. By December 26th, the night I sat at my kitchen table watching my family raise a glass to the empty chair where I used to sit, I had been operating my own client-serving business for 22 months. We had closed $340,000 in contracts. My team was 6 people deep, counting the 2 founding colleagues and 4 contractors from my vendor network who had come on in a more formal capacity over the preceding year. I had not told a single member of my family. Now that you know everything that came before it, let me take you back to December 26th. I watched the clip an 11th time that morning, and this time I did not watch it the way I had the first 10 times. Looking for information, cataloging details, noting timestamps. This time I watched it knowing exactly who each person in that frame was to me. Not in the abstract sense of family roles, in the specific documented sense of what each of them had done and said and signed and failed to sign over the previous 6 years. My father is at the head of the table. This is the man who stood in his own kitchen in March, in front of 2 witnesses, and verbally confirmed a 15% equity share that was quietly restructured away 11 months later without a single conversation. He is laughing in the clip, not loudly, comfortably, the way a person laughs when they feel completely at ease. My brother is to his left. This is the man whose name was placed on a rebranding project I had initiated, briefed, and managed through its first 2 months. Who was brought in as operational co-owner of a business I had worked inside for nearly 2 years before he arrived. Who, 14 months before this dinner, was publicly credited by my father, in front of a client, for 6 weeks of work I had delivered alone. He raises his glass without hesitation. To the right, my aunt, the one who used the word difficult at a Thanksgiving table during a year I had worked 58-hour weeks to protect a contract worth $180,000 in annual recurring revenue to the business. She is smiling. She clinks her glass with my father's first. Across from her, my other aunt, the one who had sat with me 2 years earlier over coffee and told me with genuine warmth that I simply needed to be more patient, that these things take time, that family businesses have their own rhythms and I would find my place in them if I stayed the course. She tips her glass toward my brother and nods. What is not in that 47-second clip is any hesitation, any sideways glance, any flicker of discomfort from anyone at that table. The toast is not an outburst. It is not the product of too much wine or a heated argument that escalated beyond what anyone intended. It is relaxed, deliberate. The toast of people who have settled something in their minds and are celebrating the settlement. That is the part that I need you to understand, because it is the part that is hardest to explain to someone who hasn't lived inside a dynamic like this one. The betrayal was not that they disliked me. The betrayal was that my absence had made them comfortable. I had not been removed from that table in anger. I had been removed from it as a matter of preference. and the preference had apparently been reached unanimously at some point, without ceremony. I closed the laptop at 8:47 a.m. At 9:14 a.m. on December 27th, I called my attorney. She answered on the second ring. The call lasted 19 minutes. I had retained her 14 months earlier, and she had been holding the final versions of 2 letters and 1 formal notice for 6 weeks. Documents we had prepared against the possibility that something would eventually serve as a trigger. Neither of us had anticipated that the trigger would be a 47-second video clip sent from an anonymous email address on the morning of December 26th. But the documents were ready regardless, because that is the nature of preparation. You do not build it for a specific moment. You build it so that any moment can be the one. I approved all 3 documents before 9:35 a.m. My attorney confirmed that December 30th was available on her calendar. I told her that date would work. I did not sleep well on the night of December 29th. I want to be honest about that, because I am not telling you this story to present myself as someone who operates without any internal friction. The sleeplessness was not grief. It was not second-guessing. It was the specific, low-grade anxiety that arrives when something you have been building for a very long time is finally, irrevocably, entering its last phase. It is the feeling of standing at the edge of something you constructed yourself, knowing that the construction is sound, and jumping anyway. By 6 a.m. on December 30th, I was dressed, the folder was in my bag, and I was ready. My attorney arrived at the family home at 11 a.m. on December 30th. I was not with her. That was intentional. We had discussed it in advance and agreed that her arriving alone, as a legal professional without me present, carrying only the 2 introductory documents, would accomplish something important. It would signal, before I walked through the door, that what was happening was procedural, not personal, not emotional. A business matter, handled through proper channels, by someone whose job it was to handle exactly this kind of thing. The 2 documents she delivered first were specific in scope. The first was a formal notice of IP ownership dispute, identifying the proprietary client management workflow and the software license by name, and asserting that the legal basis for the family business's continued use of both assets was contestable. The second was a letter of intent, issued on behalf of my LLC, expressing interest in a structured acquisition discussion regarding specific client accounts and operational assets. Both documents were addressed to my father by name, in his capacity as the business's principal. Both had been in final form for 6 weeks. I arrived 22 minutes later. I was wearing a dark blazer over a plain white shirt. I had chosen it the night before with the same deliberateness I had applied to everything else over the preceding 36 months. Not to make a statement, but to remove any variable that didn't need to be there. I was carrying a leather portfolio, and inside it, a physical folder. The folder was dark blue. It had 14 tab dividers, each labeled in plain typeface. I placed it on the kitchen table without announcement. My father was seated. My brother was standing near the doorway to the hall. My attorney was at the far end of the table, her own documents open in front of her. I sat down, opened the folder to the index page, and began. Tab 1 was the text message, the one my father had sent 14 months earlier, acknowledging in plain language that I had been the reason the business's largest client had renewed for a 3rd consecutive year. It had been printed at full size, dated, and notarized as a true and complete copy of the original. I placed it in the center of the table and did not elaborate. The document elaborated for itself. Tab 3 was the LLC registration certificate. Formation date, 22 months prior. I had been operating a separate, client-serving business entity for nearly 2 years. The certificate confirmed it in the way that only a state-issued legal document can, without ambiguity, without the possibility of reinterpretation. Tab 6 contained 2 signed letters of intent from clients, 2 of the family business's top 3 accounts by revenue, each expressing a formal preference to migrate their engagement. I had not solicited these letters in a vacuum. They were the documented result of 3 years of relationship maintenance, of showing up consistently and competently, of being the person those clients called when something needed to be resolved. My brother left the room before I turned to tab 6. I did not acknowledge this. I turned to tab 6. Tab 9 was a 1-page comparative revenue summary. On the left column, the family business's estimated annual revenue, derived from publicly observable sources. On the right, my LLC's closed contracts over 22 months of operation, $340,000, generated by 2 founding members and a contractor network, with no external investment and no inherited client base. The ratio was 34%. In less than 2 years, with a fraction of the infrastructure, we had generated 34 cents for every dollar the family business had produced. Tab 12 was the operating agreement. The 3 relevant clauses were highlighted in yellow: the work product ownership clause, the non-disparagement provision, and the first right of refusal on founding member contracts. My attorney had flagged the specific subsections with adhesive tabs in a second color. Nothing required explanation. The language was clear. I want to be precise about what I felt in that room, because I think people expect a particular kind of emotion from a moment like this one. And what I felt was not that. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel vindicated in any way that resembled satisfaction. What I felt was something closer to exhaustion, and beneath it, quiet relief that every document I had placed in that folder was exactly where I had put it, that every date was accurate, that every claim was supported, and that nothing in that room could be refuted by anything other than evidence I already held. The mechanics of what we were doing were not unusual. The Family Mediation Council, in a survey of more than 2,000 cases, found that mediation reached a full or partial agreement in over 70% of family disputes, and that agreements reached through that process can be taken to court and made legally binding. We were not in mediation yet, but the structure of what I had built was designed to make any resolution, negotiated, mediated, or litigated, proceed on terms I had prepared for. That is not drama. That is procedure. The folder remained open on the table. I want to be clear about something before I tell you what happened next in that room. I did not come to destroy the family business. I have said that once already, and I mean it precisely. Not as a softening disclaimer, not as a performance of reasonableness, but as a statement of actual intent. Destruction is inefficient. It is also, in most cases, unprovable in the ways that matter. What I came to do was considerably more specific. I came to restructure my relationship to the business, and to my family, on terms that were documented, enforceable, and designed to function regardless of whether anyone in that room ever felt differently about me than they had the night they raised their glasses. My attorney had prepared a 1-page options summary. 3 options, each with a distinct structure and a distinct set of implications. I placed a copy in front of my father and left the folder open to tab 12. Option A was a formal acquisition. My LLC would purchase specific client accounts and IP assets, including the proprietary workflow and the software license, at fair market value, calculated using a methodology my attorney had developed and documented. In exchange, the outstanding equity claim, the 15% share verbally confirmed in March and quietly restructured away the following January, would be formally settled. No litigation. A clean transaction with a defined closing date. Option B was a licensing arrangement. The family business could continue using the workflow and the software infrastructure on a monthly fee basis under a 3-year term. The renewal at the end of that term would be at my discretion, not negotiated jointly. Mine. This option was designed for a scenario in which the business needed operational continuity more than it needed a clean break, which, based on tab 6 and the 2 letters of intent it contained, was a scenario worth considering carefully. Option C was full mediation with a neutral third party. All outstanding claims on the table, the equity promise, the IP ownership dispute, the documented instances of credit misattribution, resolved through a structured process, with any resulting agreement submitted to the court and made legally binding. The Family Mediation Council's own survey data shows that over 70% of cases entering mediation reach a full or partial written agreement. I was prepared for that process. I had been prepared for it for months. I gave my family 10 days to respond in writing to whichever option they wished to pursue. 10 days is not a generous timeline. It is not meant to be. It is meant to signal that the period of indefinite deferral, the same mechanism that had been used to delay, dilute, and ultimately eliminate every commitment previously made to me, was no longer available as a tool. I also want to tell you what was not in any of those three options, because I think it matters. There was no apology clause. No requirement that anyone in that room acknowledge, verbally or in writing, what had happened over the preceding 6 years. I had considered it and removed it deliberately. An apology is not a contract. I had learned that lesson already, learned it in March, when a verbal confirmation made in front of witnesses turned out to be worth exactly as much as the air it was spoken into. I was not interested in words. I was interested in enforceable terms. What I had also prepared, and what I distributed as a separate one-page addendum, regardless of which option was chosen, was what I had come to think of privately as the boundary architecture. These were not emotional conditions. They were written operational terms governing any future professional or personal engagement between me and any member of my family who wished to maintain one. 3 provisions. First, no verbal agreements on financial matters of any kind. All terms to be documented in writing and countersigned by both parties before taking effect. Second, no representation of my work, my ideas, or my client relationships under any name other than my own, without prior written attribution agreed to by me. Third, a formal review every 12 months, with either party holding the right to exit any arrangement with 60 days written notice and no requirement to provide justification. I am aware that the American Psychological Association has noted in its clinical guidance on estrangement that this kind of family rupture is still treated as socially taboo, and that well-meaning professionals can cause real harm by pressuring people toward reconciliation when the conditions for safe contact have not been established. I did not build these terms out of anger. I built them because I had learned, at considerable personal cost, that goodwill without structure is not safety. It is exposure. The boundary architecture was not a wall. It was a set of load-bearing conditions under which a relationship, professional, personal, or both, could function without requiring me to absorb risk that had already proven itself to be real. The room was quiet for a long moment after I finished. Then my father looked at me and asked, in a voice that was quieter than I expected, why I had never said anything. I looked at him directly. I had not planned an answer to that specific question, but the answer came without any difficulty at all. You never asked me. 9 months later, I am sitting at a desk that belongs to me, in an office that belongs to my LLC, writing notes for a meeting that will take place in 20 minutes. Option A was chosen. The settlement was signed on January 14th, 15 days after the folder opened on my father's kitchen table. The client accounts transferred on a documented schedule. The IP dispute was resolved. The equity claim was formally settled in writing, with a figure agreed upon using the fair market valuation methodology my attorney had prepared. There was no courtroom, there was no extended litigation. There was a process, and the process worked because everything had been documented well enough in advance to make the alternative genuinely unattractive. My LLC now has 6 people. The first client whose letter of intent sat behind tab 6 has since referred 2 additional contracts to us directly. I do not describe this as victory. Victory implies that the goal was to defeat something. The goal was always to build something real, and real things produce real consequences. Referrals, renewals, compounding trust. That is not drama. That is just how work functions when it is done with integrity over time. A 2025 YouGov poll found that 38% of American adults are currently estranged from at least one family member. Cornell's Carl Pillemer puts the national estimate at 67 million people. If you are one of them, I want you to hear this clearly. Your estrangement is not your failure. It is, in many cases, the evidence that you finally stopped accepting terms that were never fair to begin with. A peer-reviewed study published in 2022 followed 263 participants through a structured support group intervention and found a statistically significant reduction in psychological distress, participants moving from moderate to mild and reporting that they felt less alone and less ashamed. The research confirms what many people already know privately. Isolation is not the same as weakness, and silence, used with intention, is not the same as surrender. They toasted my absence. I built my future during it. Document everything. Own what you build. Let the work speak at the table. The chair they left empty was the one I no longer needed.